Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Webinar Wednesdays from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, or OPR. I'm Amy Miller, the Federal Grants Administrator for OPR, and we have an excellent presentation for y'all today on indirect costs and cost allocation plans. Here to present the topic is Karen Norris from Kanoko Consulting. But first, I'd like to say a few quick words about OPR. The State Clearinghouse at OPR is the state's single point of contact for the intergovernmental review of federal grant applications. You can find all of our resources for federal grants on the OPR homepage by clicking the link for federal assistance. The Applying for Federal Grants link is where you'll go when you're applying for a federal grant and need to submit notice of your application to comply with the Intergovernmental Order on Intergovernmental Review, to the Executive Order on Intergovernmental Review. All notices can be viewed on this page under the Submissions tab. The Federal Grant Resources link will take you to a library of resources to help you learn more about applying for and managing grants, and includes links to the grant pages of every federal agency. This is also where we will post the links for the slides and recording from today's presentation. Last is our federal grants e-list, which hopefully most of you already receive, but if not, you can sign up for it here. This weekly email provides updates on federal grant opportunities, news, trainings, and events. And now a few housekeeping items. We will be sharing the slides and recording of today's presentation. You'll be receiving an email tomorrow with links to both, as well as a quick 3-question survey we hope you'll take to offer your feedback and ideas as we plan our next series of training events. So this is the 4th in our series of these grants events, but we will hope to have some more out there for the future. And so hope to get your ideas on what those should look like. Throughout the presentation, please enter any questions that you might have in the Questions tab here. And we will have time set aside at the end for Q&A. And with that, I'll turn things over to our presenter, Karen Norris. Karen is a nationally recognized expert in the grants community based in the Washington, D.C. area. She regularly presents at state and national conferences and has provided expert testimony to the Maryland General Assembly and the United States Senate Subcommittee on Federal Financial Management about grants. And we're very pleased to have her here with us today. So thank you, Karen.
Thanks, Amy. I appreciate that great introduction, and good morning, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be back with you again, delivering Webinar Wednesdays. And as Amy said, this is the 4th and last webinar in the current series. So if you like these webinars, please don't hesitate to fill out the evaluation at the end so that the governor's office can use that information as part of their planning. So let me try to advance the slide. And sometimes there's a little lag. Da, da, da. So who is attending today? I'd like to know who is in the classroom, and Amy has a poll. So please take the quick poll. There's no right or wrong answer, but it's important to record your click-throughs. So select one of the following. Are you state, county, local, or tribal government, higher education, nonprofit, or other? That was fast. Look at that. 85% are state and local, county, tribal jurisdictions, some higher ed, that's wonderful, and some nonprofit, and somebody else, 1%. So that's great. So let me go ahead. So how long have you worked with grants? 1 year or less, 2 to 5 years, 6 to 9 years, or 10 or more years? Okay, so here's more of an even split. We have some brand new people, about 1/3 of us, which is pretty amazing, and 2 to 5 years, another, 1/3, and then 6 to 9, and then we have 1/3, 10 or more years. So this is great. This is a very nice diverse class between different kinds of attendees from different institutions and different experience. So please don't hesitate to ask questions because this is your opportunity. So I need to have control again. Let's see. And I'm having difficulty. I'm sorry, guys. Let me try it again. Amy, do you think you can advance the
Yeah,
slide?
I'll just start advancing them.
Yeah. We were just talking before, there's always a glitch, right? So let's talk about our objectives for the webinar today. And we're first of all going to review definitions for direct and indirect costs. For some of you who are new, you may not know how to articulate that difference. And for those of you who are experienced, it's always good to have a review of these definitions. And then we want to gain awareness about changes to the indirect costs. So for many years, we were all using the OMB circulars to provide the guidance, how to administer grants. And starting in 2014, the uniform guidance was released and it became effective for all federal agencies and all non-federal entities. And it has just been revised again for like the third time. And there are changes to indirect costs. So we'll see what's currently in play. And then we'll talk about some of the upcoming changes that have recently been announced on August 13th. And then we're going to recognize that there's different kinds of indirect rates. There's more than one kind of indirect rate. So what are they and what are the differences and which rate would you think would be better for your organization? And then we're going to review considerations relating to indirect costs. Well, should I or shouldn't I get an indirect cost rate? And then we want to talk about cost allocation plans. So I'll try to advance. Yay. So a few words. The Office of Management and Budget, OMB, merged 8 previously separate grant circulars, which we just mentioned, into this one uniform guidance. So there were previously 8 OMB circulars merged into one. So with just that action, things are more uniform than they used to be. There's one uniform guidance as opposed to 8 different circulars. However, it is not perfectly uniform. It is not as uniform as we would have hoped. There are still many provisions in the uniform guidance that are not uniform. And it makes a difference what kind of a non-federal entity you are as to which strategy to take. So these differences are most striking when you come down to the provisions for indirect costs. Indirect costs are still very dependent upon what type of non-federal entity you are. So let's talk about direct and indirect costs and their definitions. So first of all, direct costs are those that can be identified specifically with a particular project. That project director works on that project. So the salaries of that project director are direct charges, direct costs to that project. And the definition for direct costs are there's the provision number in the current uniform guidance, which will soon be changing. It's 200.413. If for those of you who like to look up the provisions and get the direct language from the source. So direct costs are, without a doubt, can be identified with a specific project. They can be accurately assigned. There's no guesswork. And it could be the staff salaries, the salaries of the people who actually work on that project. It could be the materials and the equipment that are specifically purchased for that project, or it could be the travel that was specifically assigned to that one project. Let's see, I think there's indirect costs. Let me see if I can go backwards. Oh, it keeps going forward. There we go. Dun, da, da, da. So indirect costs are defined at provision number 200.56. And indirect costs are shared costs. That's the word I like to use. Um, they're shared and they cannot be easily identified with one particular program. These costs might help or support a program, but they're not easily identified. So another word for shared, and in the accounting field, is allocated. They're allocated costs. So what are some examples then? Well, what do you mean, Karen? They're shared, but they're not, and they help a project, but they're not exactly, identified with one project. So think about the payroll department for as an example. Let's say you have an employee, and this employee, it doesn't matter actually, any employee. These employees could work on grant project A, grant project B, grant project C, grant project D, or they might not work on a grant project at all. They may just work directly for the institution. So everybody who works, no matter where you work, no matter what project you're on or not on, if you work, you're going to get a paycheck. Simple as that. And the good people who work in the payroll department are going to help create that paycheck for you. Everybody gets a paycheck, so everybody shares the payroll department. So payroll would be an example of an indirect cost. It helps the project, it helps all projects, but it's not specific to just one project. Human resources is the same way. If you have to hire somebody, it doesn't matter who you're hiring for, whether it's for a grant or not a grant. Human resources is going to help you. So there are shared costs. Maintenance, your copier is broken, your computer needs assistance. It doesn't matter if you're on a grant or not on a grant, or which grant are you on. Maintenance is going to come help you. So again, and utilities, you walk into a room, it doesn't matter whose room it is. You flip the light switch and the utilities are going, the lights are going to come on. So indirect costs are shared costs. It doesn't matter which activity or project you're assigned to. And other people will use words like, oh, well, you're talking about overhead costs. I said, yes, that's a word that people use for indirect costs. Overhead costs, administrative costs, shared costs, and allocated costs. Those are all words that are often associated with indirect costs. Amy, I'm just going to need you to, there, great. So another definition is something called modified total direct cost. And that's a type of a formula that's used. So modified total direct cost is a subset of total direct costs. So total direct cost would be all the costs that would be associated with a particular project. Modified total direct cost modifies it. They have two different categories. So those costs that are included in modified total direct costs and those costs that are excluded. So included costs are salaries, fringe benefits, materials, services, travel, and subawards up to $25,000. Excluded from the modified total direct cost formula is equipment, capital expenditures, patient care, rentals, tuition, scholarships, and participant support costs. So if you're a hospital, for example, and you have a lot of costs associated with patient care, modified total direct costs may not be the best formula for you to use. If you're an institution of higher ed and you have a tuition and student scholarships, maybe MTDC would not be the best choice for you either. Maybe it would work out, but maybe not because of these exclusions that you can't count. So what are the rules to determine the difference? And that's at 200 a provision number 200-412, and I love this. The first thing it says is, well, there is no universal rule. You know, it depends. It depends on the kind of institution you are, and indirect costs are very individual. Even one higher institution of higher ed or one nonprofit may not necessarily have a similar indirect cost rate to another nonprofit. So indirect costs are very distinct for each individual entity. The important thing with indirect costs is once you use them, once you have an indirect cost rate, you remain consistent. You treat it the same way for every grant, and you don't want to double charge anything as both direct and indirect at the same time. So let's look, so those are the basic principles and the basic definitions for direct and indirect costs. Let's talk about what some of the changes are. So this provision is at 200-414C. And under the old circulars, federal agencies and pass-through entities could arbitrarily decide when they were awarding grants, whether or not they were going to let their recipients or their subrecipients use indirect costs. It was their decision, their arbitrary decision. And of course, that created a lot of angst for the recipients and the subrecipients who had indirect cost rates and they wanted to use them. So one of the differences between the old circulars and the uniform guidance, and it's still true with the proposed revisions, is that federal agencies and pass-through entities must accept a non-federal entity's approved rate. If a non-federal entity has an approved indirect rate, it has to be accepted with one exception, and that is if there's a public law like the program statute or the approved federal agency regulation otherwise. A program statute that's regulatory, it's a public law. A federal agency regulation, again, that's a public law. So if there is some public law to the contrary, you know, unless there's some public law, federal awarding agencies and pass-through awarding agencies have to accept the rate. So this reduces the granting agency ability to restrict or deny indirect costs arbitrarily, and it reminds non-federal entities to check other things beyond the uniform guidance. Don't forget to check the program statute or the federal agency reg if you're receiving federal funds, or even your state statutes if it's appropriate. 200-331 is a provision for pass-through entities, and it says that a pass-through entity has to accept a subrecipient's approved rate, or if there is no rate, pass-throughs would negotiate a rate in compliance with the uniform guidance. So that's what that means with this part, in compliance with the uniform guidance, or they would allow the 10% de minimis flat rate to eligible subrecipients. So this is something new for pass-through entities, because before they didn't have to negotiate indirect rates. And so that creates a new administrative burden for pass-through entities who may now be asked to help a subrecipient negotiate a rate. Another change is that indirect rates now can be extended for up to 4 years. It used to be that non-federal entities who were applying for an indirect rate would have to submit a proposal every single year. Now, in some circumstances, non-federal entities may keep the same rate for up to 4 years if they like it. And it requires written approval from the federal agency, and your revenue has to be stable from year to year to year in order. So a state government, a county government, a city government, for example, would be good candidates to extend a rate for 4 years. If they want, and that reduces the burden of having to do that proposal every single year. And once you get to the end of the 4 years, you can request the extension again for another 4 years. So waived or unrecovered indirect costs is described at 200-306. And if you notice, there are a lot of different provisions that are mentioned. You've got some 2-digit numbers, you've got 300 numbers, you've got 400 numbers, 200.300 something, 200.400 something, and you also have 5 different appendices in the uniform guidance. Appendix 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 all have to do with indirect costs. So if you're looking up information in the uniform guidance, take a note that these provisions about indirect costs are all over the uniform guidance. So if you find some information when you're looking, don't stop looking, because there may be additional information in another section of the uniform guidance that's important, that would be important to you. So the waived or unrecovered indirect cost provision says that once a rate is approved, a non-federal entity may elect to waive indirect costs. So if you have an approved rate, you don't have to take it if you don't want to. You can waive it. You can waive all of it, or you can waive some of it. And why would people waive a rate if they've gone to the trouble of getting one? Well, if you have a cost sharing requirement, let's say you have a 28% indirect cost rate, and on the grant that you're applying for has a required 20% match, and it's hard to come up with a match requirement. You know, if people had money around for match, they wouldn't be applying for the grants. So this is a very nice option with indirect costs. You can take some of your indirect cost rate and say, okay, I'm just not going to recover. I'm going to waive it, and then I can use that to satisfy my cost sharing. So in the example, if someone has a 28% indirect cost rate and there's 20% mandatory cost sharing, they can say, okay, I'll waive 20% of my 28% indirect cost rate. I'll apply that for the cost sharing, and there's 8% left over that I can still use for indirect costs. What if it's a 28% indirect cost rate and it's a 30% cost sharing requirement? They can still waive their indirect costs. They can say, I'm going to waive all of my indirect costs, and now I only have to come up with 2% more, which is a whole lot easier to cope with rather than coming up with 30% match. So that's explained in 200-306, which might be of interest to you all. So here we're ready to take another poll. Amy, do you have a poll to put up? Yay. So select one of the following. Federal agencies and pass-through entities must restrict or deny indirect cost rates, must accept the negotiated indirect cost rate, may arbitrarily refuse indirect rates, or may arbitrarily accept negotiated indirect rates. So which one? You're not going to have to pass an exam. It's just and if you're not sure, just click on something. It's okay. We just want to see your click-throughs. People are thinking. Okay, so must restrict or deny indirect cost rates? No, they can't. They can only restrict or deny it if there is some program statute that gives you the ability to do so. But otherwise, in the default is you must accept the negotiated indirect cost rate. So that's great. And so then they may arbitrarily, a few people said something may arbitrarily accept it. No, nothing's arbitrary anymore with indirect costs. It's all defined in the statute. So the default is the granting agencies, federal or pass-through, must accept the negotiated a non-federal entity's indirect rate, unless there is some specific public law, some specific statute to the contrary. Okay, so moving on. Good job, everybody. So, all right, well, let's talk about these different kinds of indirect cost rates. What are they? So they're rates and they're formulas. And there are different kinds of rates and there are different kinds of formulas. And some non-federal entities may have more than one indirect cost rate. I came from the education field, and when I became an administrator, I became the grants administrator first for some K-12s in the state of Maryland, and then I worked for institutions of higher ed. And a community college that I worked at had 3 different rates. We had an on-campus indirect rate, we had an off-campus indirect cost rate, and we treated our fringe benefit rate as an indirect cost rate. So we actually had 3 different indirect cost rates. Smaller non-federal entities would possibly have 1 rate, or they would possibly have their indirect rate and the fringe benefit rate for their salaries. So let's see what some of the typical types of rates are. You have something called a provisional rate that becomes a final rate. You have a rate called a predetermined rate, one called fixed rate with carry forward. We have the de minimis or 10% flat rate. We have something called facilities and administrative rates, F&A, and fringe benefits. These are the most common rates. There may be some additional ones too, but these are the most common. So let's talk about each of them. So the provisional rates are, and they're defined in 200-414. These are temporary or optional rates, and they're an estimate, and they're usually applied before a final rate is approved. So a non-federal entity would be applying for an indirect cost rate, and they're filling out a proposal. And maybe the federal agency who's reviewing the proposal has some questions. Well, we don't understand this calculation, or we don't understand your definition of why this salary is a direct cost rather than an indirect cost. And there's some back and forth with the recipient and the awarding agency while they're sorting out the information in the proposal. And now we're getting close to the start of the non-federal entity's fiscal year, and they're not ready to make a final decision yet, to award a final rate. So there is an option to have, well, I can get you an estimated rate based on the information we currently have. I can give you a provisional rate, and you can go ahead and use it while you're waiting for the final rate to be finalized. So there's a benefit and there's a risk to that. And the benefit is obvious. Well, it enables a non-federal entity to use a temporary estimated indirect rate while they're waiting for the approved final rate. So that's a good thing. You know, you can start that fiscal year using an indirect rate. The risk is, what if the provisional rate turns out to be different than the final rate? And they usually are different. They might not be different by a lot, but they're good. You know, maybe the agency says, how about, you know, it looks like you're going to be pretty close to 20%. So go ahead and use 20% for your provisional rate. And when the calculations are finally done and the proposal's finalized, what if they end up with an 18% indirect rate instead of the 20% estimated provisional rate? Well, now they've been overcharging indirect rates the whole time they were using that provisional rate. So now the non-federal entity is going to have a debt to repay the awarding agency, the federal government, actually, because these indirect costs are generally negotiated by the federal government. So, so that's the risk. You know, if it were me and I was given the choice, well, we're not ready yet, we can't confer the final rate, we'll give you a provisional rate, I would lowball it. Let's really lowball it. Low is better than nothing. Let's stick with a 10%, you know, and that way, something that we know we're not going to get overcharged. By the way, if you lowball it at the end when it's finally, let's say it was the reversed and you were using an 18% indirect rate as a provisional rate, and then you ended up, when all was said and done, the final rate was 20%. Well, it's the worst of both worlds. You are not going to be reimbursed for that extra 2% if you lowball it. The only good news is that you don't have to pay any money back. So if you use a provisional rate that's too high, you're going to have a debt to repay. And if you use a provisional rate that's too low, you're not going to get the full benefit and you're not going to be repaid the difference. But at least you don't have a debt. So that's the lesser of the two evils. So final rates are defined in 200-414 and Appendix 4 of the Uniform Guidance. And the final rates are based on actual costs from a prior period. So the rates are proposed and negotiated each year. They're calculated. The non-federal entity has to use submit a proposal each year. And once it's approved, though, the final rates are not subject to an adjustment. They're not like the provisional rates. Once you get your final rate, you're good to go for the year. And then, well, what if things change and you're going to have a different rate the next year? Not to worry. That's why you fill out another proposal for the next year. And then if the final rate is a little different, not a problem. That rate is going to be your go-to rate for the rest of the year, and then so on and so forth for each consecutive year. So final rates can change from year to year depending upon your calculation. So it's hard to submit an indirect cost rate proposal. It takes a minimum of 2 years. I have seen it take 3 to 5 years easily. So here's a basic timeline. If you were trying to get an indirect cost rate for 2020, for this year, typically you would have started 2 years ago in 2018, and you would look at the audited financial statements from 2018 because that would give you actual costs. You have to base your calculation on actual costs. And then during 2019, you would develop and submit your proposal using the actual costs from 2018. And the goal is to get that proposal completed and submitted early enough in the year in 2019 so that the reviewing agency, the federal awarding agency, has enough time to review it and say, okay, we can approve it, you're good to go for 2020. And what happens is sometimes that 1 year, the year that the non-federal entity is developing the proposal and submitting it, and then the federal agency's got to review and approve it, sometimes that takes longer. So that's why there's that issue with the provisional rate. So what does the proposal look like? Well, here's a sample worksheet, and a non-federal entity is going to look at its audited financial statements, and it's going to start dividing up all the costs per year into columns. This column, these are my indirect costs, and these are all my direct costs. And then they're going to subtotal that, and okay, here's my subtotal of indirect costs, and here's my subtotal of direct costs. Now I've got to subtract. So what are you going to subtract? Well, you're going to subtract anything that might be unallowable, like, alcohol. Alcohol is never allowable. Fundraising costs, entertainment costs. For those types of non-federal entities that do fundraising as a standard, a business standard, there are a lot of costs that you have to back out. They're considered unallowable costs. And then there would be same thing for the direct costs. You would back out anything unallowable, and then you would back out any adjustment for a formula. So the formulas always affect the direct costs. They don't affect the indirect costs. They are what they are. But the direct costs are affected by the formula you use. So for example, if this particular non-federal entity who was filling out this worksheet was using modified total direct costs as a formula, they would have to subtract out all the equipment and the patient care costs and the tuition. So anything that was excluded from that formula, they were going to have to subtract it. And then you end up with your total usable direct costs and your total indirect costs. Now, the formulas will take different iterations depending upon what type of formula you use, but they all end up with the same proportion. you take what the figure, the indirect cost figure that you're using is the numerator, and the denominator are the direct costs. That's the direct cost base, and that ratio provides the percentage. And there's your indirect cost rate. So that's a very simple way of explaining how indirect costs are basically calculated. So let's talk about predetermined rates. These are like the Cadillac of rates. They're the easiest to apply for, and they're not based on actuals. They're based on estimated costs. And so they're not subject to adjustment. So the proposal is easy. It's much easier to do a proposal for a predetermined rate rather than for a final rate, that kind of a rate. So it's a type of fixed rate, and it's good for stable, established non-federal entities who receive basically the same awards, the formula grants, the mandatory grants, year after year after year. There's not too much fluctuation in their revenue, so the indirect cost rate is not going to change very much from year to year. So what they do is they can estimate, well, we had a 18% indirect cost rate last year, and our revenue and our grant awards are basically the same. So we're just going to estimate we're going to need 18% this coming year. And then at the end of the year, the actuals are compared to the estimates, just to make sure that, yeah, the revenue was about the same. And traditionally, non-federal entities that have these predetermined rates, their actuals are always close to the estimates. There's very little fluctuation. And so that's like the Cadillac of a rate, because it's the least burdensome to take. Now, what happens if you have a predetermined rate and all of a sudden there's a big change in your revenue for the year? Maybe you've lost an appropriation, or this year, if you're one of these recipients who has COVID funding, you know, that's a whole bunch of funding that was not available previously. Maybe you have more revenue than you typically do because of the COVID funding. So it's going to create a change in your revenue. So if this change occurs during the year, you don't have to pay back the debt. But when you compare the estimated cost to the actual cost at the end of the year, and if there was something that has changed, then you would just carry forward the difference to the next year. And you would need prior written approval from the awarding agency. So if there is a change like that, you probably wouldn't be able to do predetermined rates for the next year or so, and you wouldn't have a 4-year extension. You would have to probably go and calculate a final rate again until things have evened off and you're back to a stable revenue stream. The de minimis rate was a new indirect rate under the uniform guidance. It did not exist under the old circulars, and it was created to help small non-federal entities who never had an indirect cost rate before, and they just lacked the capacity or the wherewithal to calculate an indirect cost rate for themselves. So they just never had one. You know, and so the current eligibility requirements are never, ever, ever, ever had an indirect cost rate before, and you are a smaller non-federal entity in that you have under $35 million of federal funds in any given year. And if that's the case, then you are eligible for this 10% flat rate, but it's going to be based on modified total direct costs. But once you don't have to fill out a proposal, you don't have to do a calculation. Once you decide you want to use the 10% de minimis rate, you can use it indefinitely. It really was very well received in the grant community. Big help to smaller non-federal entities, so much so that some other non-federal entities would say, well, wait a minute, we tried to get an indirect cost rate before, and we got and because we really wanted one, and it was so hard to go through that proposal and that approval process that we gave up on it. We used that indirect cost rate once and then never went back to it again, and now you're telling, and we're not using one. And you're telling us we don't qualify for the de minimis? We would love to have the de minimis rate. So one of the changes in the revision of the uniform guidance, which I think is going to also be very well received in the grant community, is okay, any non-federal entity can use the 10% de minimis rate. You don't have to never, ever, ever had one before. If you had one, couldn't keep up with it, don't have an indirect cost rate now, and you want to use the de minimis, go for it. So the only exception is if you already have a negotiated rate, you cannot use the de minimis. But if you don't have a current negotiated rate, no matter what your prior history is, you're eligible for the de minimis rate. So that's going to be good news for a lot of non-federal entities who just couldn't cope with the burden. And a lot of non-federal entities have to hire a CPA firm to put the proposal together for them because they just lack the capacity to do it themselves. Well, that's a cost. That's an expense, you know, and that some non-federal entities just don't have that expense in their budgets. So this de minimis flat rate is going to be good news. So there's no required de minimis rate proposal, and the benefit is, of course, it's reduced administrative burden, and it's giving non-federal entities opportunity to use an indirect cost rate, you know, a 10% rate, you know, where they would not have been able to have any indirect cost rate before. So those are the benefits. And then the risks are, well, you know, if you don't go through that exercise where you have to look at all your costs and you have to put them down on a piece of paper with a line drawn down the middle, these are the direct costs, these are the indirect costs, you may have a lack of knowledge about direct and indirect costs, and you may have that, I skipped a bullet, you may have a lack of knowledge about modified total direct costs. You may think, oh, I can take 10% and I can have 10% against everything, and no, you cannot. You have to understand what's in those categories for MTDC. And you have to apply things consistently. You can't use it on one grant one way and on another grant another way, and you can't double count a cost. You can't count the same cost as both direct and indirect at the same time. So it still requires some understanding, even if you're using the 10% flat rate. So what we're finding from the coming out of the audit community is that there is a new growing best practice nationally, in that non-federal entities who want to use that de minimis rate should create a local policy and procedure or a local certification about the de minimis rate, with the intent to provide reasonable assurance to the awarding agencies that you know how to use the rate. Yes, we're going to use the 10% de minimis rate. We're eligible for it. We do not currently have a negotiated rate. We have less than $35 million of federal funds, certainly far less than $35 million. And we understand what a direct cost is. Here's some examples. We understand what an indirect cost is. Here's some examples. And we understand what MTDC is. Here's the definition. And we're going to use the 10% indirect cost properly. So that helps provide reasonable assurance. And it also gives auditors something to audit against. Oh, they've got a certification. Oh, they have a local written policy. They know what they're doing. They understand how to use the de minimis rate. So we find no proposal necessary, but it would be good to have a local policy or procedure or a local certification. So the de minimis rate, so the proposed revisions to the uniform guidance, as we said, expand the use of the de minimis rate to more non-federal entities. So the pending final rule, we were expecting it by the end of this year. The final rule was published in the Federal Register 6 days ago on August 13th. So you can Google that and get a copy of it. It's in the Federal Register. August 13th is the final rule. So what they came up with the final language for the revision is that any non-federal entity that does not currently have a negotiated rate, and as long as you're under that $35 million of federal funds, you can use the de minimis rate. No proposal. You can use it indefinitely for as long as you want. So that's a good change. Okay, let me try again. Amy, can you give me, thank you. So here's a poll. So Amy's going to put up the poll. So the de minimis rate is a 10%, and then choose one of the flat rate based on modified total direct costs, MTDC. It's a negotiated indirect cost rate, or it's a flat rate based on total direct costs, or it's a negotiated rate that can be used for only 1 year. So again, don't worry if you pick the wrong one, just click through. So go ahead and pick the one that you think best fits. People are thinking. Here we go. So good for you guys. 73% of you said it was a flat rate based on modified total direct costs. Very good. And then it is not a negotiated at all. It's you just take the 10% rate. You decide, I want to use it, and you can. Now, as long as you're, oops, there we go. As long as you are under 35 million. And then it's a flat rate, but it's not based on total direct cost. It's a flat rate based on modified total direct cost. And a lot of people have confusion with that. They don't know what modified, they've never heard of modified total direct costs before. So that's something you have to learn about if you want to use the de minimis rate. And then again, it's not a negotiated rate, it's a flat rate. And you just decide you want it as long as you know how to use it. And once you decide you want it, you can use it indefinitely for as long as you want, year after year after year. Thanks, Amy. I think you might have done that for me. So let's talk about facilities and administrative rates, F&A rates. These are typically used by institutions of higher education because they have very large campuses. You know, not only do they have the regular overhead rate, you know, cost like everybody else, payroll, maintenance, utilities, but they also have great big facilities and big campuses that they have to take care of. So they have a certain kind of rate where they put all the facilities costs together, and then they put all the administrative costs together, and they use a particular formula, and they come up with an F&A rate. So institutions of higher education, because many IHEs have large campuses, they're going to have higher indirect cost rates because of their big campuses. Legitimately, they just have more indirect costs, more grass cutting, more snow removal, you know, and more maintenance for all those buildings. So they do have more costs than another type of a non-federal entity. Fringe benefits is a type of an indirect cost rate. It's shared employee benefits. So they're shared costs, and they might include everybody gets health benefits, or there might be different kinds of leave, you know, a week of vacation, or jury duty, or sick leave, personal leave. Maybe there's a retirement count. If you work for the state government, you would be participating in the state retirement plan. And if you work for a county or city government, you might also be eligible for that state retirement plan. That would be part of your shared costs for employee benefits. Some entities have wellness programs and offer gym memberships or parking, or commuter fees. So there are all kinds of costs that go into fringe benefits for employees that employees share. And depending upon how you calculate your indirect costs, depending on how you treat fringe benefits, it depends on the calculation. There's a different calculation. So fringe benefits can be included with all the other indirect costs and be rolled into the indirect cost rate, or they can be calculated separately as a separate second rate. And then that looks like, here is the standard, a little excerpt of the typical federal budget form, where you have these budget categories of personnel, fringe benefit, travel, equipment, supplies, and so forth. And then you subtotal your direct charges, then you add indirect, and then you get the total of the amount of money that you're requesting for the grant that you're applying for. So depending upon how you calculate indirect costs, if it's rolled into indirect costs with everything else, you would leave zero at that that red line that says fringe benefits, because it would just be combined with all the indirect costs down below. But if you did the calculation where there was a second formal calculation with fringe benefits, then you could charge fringe benefits to the grant as a direct cost, and then it would also be, a portion of it would be combined with the indirect costs. So it all depends on the formula. So what are some considerations with direct and indirect costs? Excuse me. Well, first of all, should I apply for one? Or maybe we shouldn't bother with it, not to pursue a negotiated rate. Well, to pursue it, it's going to take time. It's going to require knowledge and skills. It takes resources to prepare the proposal. Maybe you have to hire a CPA firm in order to get a negotiated rate. You have to submit it. It has to be reviewed. It has to be negotiated. You might need to revise it and submit it again, and it goes through review again, on and on. And sometimes it's subject to audit findings because something wasn't calculated right. And it's going to require a written policy or an indirect cost statement. It's going to require it. So, that's a lot of work for a negotiated indirect cost rate. But on the other hand, if you don't charge indirect costs, it allows, well, some people think this is a good thing. It allows all awarded funds to support direct costs. Now, if you're an awarding agency, you would love it if all the money that's being used from the grant award is going to go for the grant award for the direct costs. They would love it. And even program staff, oh yeah, that's my grant. I don't want my grant money. I worked hard on that grant proposal. I don't want my grant money to be used to pay for the administrative costs, the general overhead costs of the institution. I want that money to go for my grant. So some people like it when there's no indirect costs. But on the other hand, there's the issues. If charging indirect costs helps relieve a really big financial burden for the recipient institution, they're allowed to capture, payroll and utilities. All of those indirect costs help the grant projects. So wouldn't it be fair if the grant projects contribute toward some of those costs? So financial staff who have to balance the books and have to work with these budgets, the financial staff understand all too well how important charging indirect cost is. It's a tremendous burden on a nonprofit or an institution of higher ed or even a state or local government. Overhead costs are a burden. So if the awarded grants can help contribute toward part of that, that relieves the financial burden for the institution, for the agency. Now, once you have your indirect costs, you still have the option. You can take all of it or you can waive it. You don't have to take all of it all the time. So that would require a conversation within your own organization. Should we or shouldn't we negotiate a rate? And once we have a rate, should we charge everything we possibly can to a grant, or should we reduce the rate a little bit? And then, we can use our indirect cost rate toward cost sharing, which is awesome because it is hard to come up with a required match. We have to hunt all over for it to come up with an acceptable match. If we can just say, we're not going to take indirect costs and use indirect costs to satisfy it, it's easy to define, it's easy to value, it's easily added, put on the budget sheet. It's easy to audit. It's a great way to meet cost sharing requirements. It takes the pressure off of finding additional cost sharing. So once a non-federal entity has its indirect cost rate, it can waive it. It can claim a lower amount, or it doesn't have to claim anything. It can use the waived or unrecovered indirect costs for cost sharing, and but you have to have prior approval from the awarding agency. Don't forget that. And then more of the funding will go to direct costs then for the project. So that's a very nice compromise. It makes good use of the indirect costs, but it still allows more money to go to direct costs for the project. What about this de minimis rate? So the way the current provision is written, never, ever, ever had an indirect rate before, and under 35 million. Now, the final rule was released August 13th, and the revisions go into effect in November. I think they said November 12th. So now eligibility is if you don't have any non-federal entity that doesn't currently have a negotiated rate can use the 10% de minimis if you want to. So you still have to be eligible under 35 million for federal awards. The hang up is understanding what modified total direct costs are. You've got to understand that definition or you're going to get audit findings for using it the wrong way. But once you get it, you can use it indefinitely. There's no need for a proposal, those horrible proposals to fill out. You have to be consistent though, can't double dip. And what we're finding is, okay, there's no proposal, but put something down on paper. Commit something to paper, formally that's signed by an authorized representative of your institution or your agency. Create a local policy or certification that describes how the de minimis rate would be applied. Provide people with reasonable assurance that you know how to use it. That will go a long way. All right, so we're going to shift gears a little bit now, and we're going to talk about cost allocation plans. Cost allocation plans are generally for state governments. They could be for county governments. They could be for very large institutions of higher education, but they are in addition to an indirect cost rate. So they're associated with indirect costs of a larger agency. And the larger agency is there's your California State House with your flag. I was so excited to find that picture for you for this slide presentation, by the way. And so you have a larger agency, and this larger agency is going to have related agencies. So example would be the state government would be the larger agency. And then the state government has county governments and maybe even city governments that have a relationship in their broader infrastructure. The local governments are not part of the state government. They're separate jurisdictions, but they're related. They have an established relationship with the state government. So the cost allocation and indirect costs. Cost allocation plans involve indirect costs that are shared among agencies. So just as a reminder, your regular indirect costs are shared overhead or administrative costs within one organization or one agency. That institution of higher ed has a 53% indirect cost rate. That nonprofit has a 16% indirect cost rate. That state government has a 12% indirect cost rate. Whatever the rate is, it's just for the one agency. Now you have this situation where you have a big agency and you have lots of related agencies, and they share indirect costs among them. So the cost allocation plan is shared costs among these related agencies. So you can have the county governments that have a relationship with the state. You can have the city governments that have relationships with the county. You might have public institutions like the state Board of Education, and you have all the local school districts. So here is a little graphic that I created. There's your state in the middle. And you have 1, 2, 3, 4, you have 4 counties and 1 city that, and a separate, incorporated city. And they all have a relationship with the state government. So what would this relationship be? What would it entail? So, the retirement plan that we talked about, for example, all state employees participate in a state retirement plan usually, or they have the option to participate in a state retirement plan. Most states have a state retirement plan. Well, what if you work for a county government? Or what if you work for a local educational agency in the state? You're a public employee within the state, are you able to participate in the state retirement plan? So that would be that's a very typical shared indirect cost. The state government would open up its retirement plan to the local jurisdictions who are in its infrastructure, its larger, its extended family, so you have your immediate family of the state employees, and then you have your extended family, like your cousins, and so that's what these related agencies are. Another example is the county snow removal or the grass cutting contract. Maybe the city governments could use the same contract and get a deal on their snow removal or their grass cutting. I know a lot of parts of California. I'm laughing because I taught this in Florida, and when I gave the example of snow removal, because I'm from Maryland and snow removal is a pain in the neck for us in the wintertime, and so they looked at me like, huh? Snow removal? I said, oh, grass cutting. Think of it as grass cutting. So anyway, laughing about that because there are plenty of places in California that wouldn't have snow. And so here, what are some examples? What are some more examples of shared cost in a cost allocation plan? Well, maybe it's motor pools, or maybe they have state vehicles or county vehicles available for people to use for official business. What about computer centers? Your retirement or your state pension plans, biggies, those are very typical. Snow removal and grass cutting are typical. Copier paper, what happens is the state can get a procurement contract for copier paper or toner or pens and pencils, things that everybody uses. And because they're bigger agencies, they have bigger volume, they get attractive pricing on these items. Well, maybe it would be nice if other people had access to that procurement contract and could also have, enjoy that attractive pricing that the state has already negotiated. And look what it would do to everybody's procurement and bid process. There's no need to do a big bid and to go through that whole procurement process and to negotiate and to try to get the shipping costs included. And if you're a public institution or agency, don't charge us tax, no tax. And what a great benefit would it be if I could just order the copier paper from the state procurement contract? So these are all benefits of a cost allocation plan if your state happens to have one. Not all states have one. Maintenance of your websites. Everybody has to make sure their websites are up and running. And if the state has a very attractive contract with a website a developer or maintenance person, that would be great if I could use them too. You know how it is just when you live in a neighborhood. Who does your neighbor use for painting? Oh, are they good? Oh, do they have good prices? Oh, can I have their contact information? I'd like to use them too. It's human nature. You want to get the best deal possible when you're buying things, whether you're buying stuff or you're buying services. So for state and local governments, and there are your provisions. It's 204.16, Appendix 1, Appendix 4. For states, local, and tribal governments that provide centralized, and even territorial governments, that provide centralized or, I'm sorry, it's Appendix 6, not 4, me and my Roman numerals, right? So I'm sorry, territorial governments, for some reason, are not included in Appendix 6. So if you work with tribal governments, territorial governments, tribal governments are included, territorial governments are not included. A territorial government would have to contact and ask permission. But so for states, local, and tribal governments that provide centralized or shared services to related agencies, and this is direct from the verbiage in the uniform language, there needs to be a process whereby these central services costs can be identified and assigned on a reasonable basis. And the cost allocation plan provides that process. It's how the larger organization figures out, okay, these are my own indirect costs, and then these are the indirect costs that I'm going to share with other agencies that are in my extended family. So a larger agency will usually have two types of indirect costs. They'll have the indirect costs for the agency itself, for its own business, for its own overhead, its own allocated cost. And then if it has a cost allocation plan that it's going to make available to extended jurisdictions within its network, it may also have a cost allocation plan. Now, I want to mention here that, the English language is an amazing language. And, there are times when people will use words differently. And one of these differences is with the term cost allocation plan. The way I am using cost allocation plan is just how I'm describing it. And I'm referring back to the provisions in the uniform guidance that also provide direction on how to use these cost allocation plans. And I'm talking about a plan that outlines how a larger entity will share some of its indirect costs with its related smaller entities within its extended infrastructure. Now, some people will use cost allocation plan differently. So in order to address that, some people will use this term when they're working on their proposal for their own indirect costs, and they have a worksheet that they're working on. And if you remember, we had that slide with the blue worksheet on it where, okay, someone who fills out a proposal is going to look at their audited financial statements, and they're going to pull out all the costs that were on the actual costs that were on their audited statements, or whether they're doing the predetermined estimated one, they're still looking at their estimated costs. So they're going to divide up their costs still between the direct and the indirect costs. Now, most people will call that a worksheet to help them with the raw data that's going to be applied to the indirect cost rate formula. Most people will call that process, that step in the indirect cost rate proposal, oh, I'm going to use my worksheet, where I'm going to divide my costs into these two columns, direct costs and indirect costs. Some people will call that, oh, I've got to do a cost allocation plan. I've got to allocate, I've got to look at all my costs, and I've got to allocate them on either one side or the other side of this divider line. They're either going to be direct costs or they're going to be indirect costs, but they're talking, the difference is, the distinction is in the use of this term is the person talking about the costs, the indirect costs within their own agency only, or are they talking about costs from their agency that they're going to share with other agencies? So the formal use of this term is just what we've been talking about. You have a larger entity, and they're going to look at the indirect costs that they could possibly share with other separate jurisdictions or entities that are totally separate from them, but they are related through this broader extended family. It's not just a cost allocation plan as a worksheet only for one agency. So some of you may have heard this term before, and the reason I'm spending a little bit of time with it is because it does cause confusion, because there is a pretty big percentage of people who use this phrase when they're talking about the worksheet that they're using to figure out their own indirect cost rate. They don't realize that it's a formal term that's used for this other circumstance with the larger agency and the related agencies. So in Appendix 5 of the Uniform Guidance, Appendix 5, Section A.2 includes a reference to a brochure published by HHS, so the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, a guide for state, local, and Indian tribal governments, cost principles and procedures for developing cost allocation plans, and indirect cost rates for agreements with the federal government. So this is just a great guide, and it gives you it gives you the link to how you can get it. It's free. And even if you're not a health related agency, it's still appropriate. It's good guidance. HHS is the largest grant making agency of all the federal agencies. It is so large, it gives out so much grant funding that all of the federal agencies added up together do not equal the amount of money. Can you imagine? Everybody else added up together does not equal the amount of money that HHS gives out. So there are no close seconds. And as a result of that, HHS has publications that are available to a broader audience, not just health related institutions or agencies. So in Appendix 5, Appendix 5 has some definitions. And in a cost allocation plan, they are dividing the costs into allocated or assigned costs. And these are the indirect costs that can be shared with the related agencies, and build costs. Two different kinds of costs are defined in this cost allocation plan. So the allocated costs are going to be shared with the related agencies at no cost to the related agencies. They're just going to be able to take the benefit of it. But there may be some costs that the state agency will share that is not included in their indirect cost pool, so they're going to have to charge for them. So the procurement contracts, for example, like the grass cutting or the snow removal or the landscaping or the procurement copier paper or the toner, those are likely not included in their big indirect cost pool. So they can still make those contracts available, but the other entities will have to pay for the services. Now, that's not such a bad thing because the payment is going to be less than what you would have had to pay if you just did it directly by yourself. When I worked for my community college, we always piggybacked onto the county's grass cutting and snow removal contracts. And they would open them up to us. They would charge us under build costs, but we would get the benefit of their pricing, which was much cheaper than what we would have had. We were able to negotiate individually with just one customer for a contractor. So we would always use the county's snow removal and grass cutting contracts. We'd pay for it, but we were still happy with that. So again, the allocated costs are the shared or the assigned cost. They're shared by the larger agency with the smaller agencies within its network. There's no fees for the smaller agencies. They just get this wonderful benefit. And the allocated costs are incorporated into the indirect cost rate proposal of the larger agency. So a larger agency is not going to be out, they're not going to have this big financial burden. They are going to get reimbursed, but they're going to get reimbursed through their indirect cost rate proposal rather than billing these smaller entities. So the example is the state retirement plan. If your state has a state retirement plan, it's more than likely that the county governments and the city governments and even the school systems, the public school systems, those employees also get that benefit. I know I did. When I worked in the state of Maryland, when I worked for my K-12s, my county, my local educational agencies, and then I went on to work for institutions of higher ed, public institutions in my state, I was always able to participate in that state retirement plan, which was a wonderful benefit. Build costs, just to, to reiterate, is again, they're shared costs by the larger agency with the related agencies outside of its structure, or it could be outside of its indirect cost rate proposal. It's just an additional cost. So the related agencies outside of its structure could even be recipients and subrecipients. So can you imagine if you had a federal via state grant, or a state grant, and you're a subrecipient, you still might be able to use the state's grass cutting plan and snow removal and buy their copier paper. You may be able to do that too. You just have to ask. And so, however, you're going to be billed for it. But it's going to be less money than if you were to go and buy your ream of paper in the office supply store by yourself. So the build costs are shared by the larger agency with related agencies outside of its structure, like recipients and subrecipients could be eligible for this. Or it's with related agencies when the cost is not part of their indirect cost rate. Procurement contracts are generally not part of a state's indirect cost rate, whereas their retirement plan generally is. So build costs earn revenue for the larger agency. They're going to charge the smaller agencies for these services. So the money that they earn is like program income. The money that they earn is treated as direct costs, not indirect costs. Like the copier paper that they make available. You can buy the copier paper. In Maryland, they had, as part of the state use industries, which was a nice way of saying the prison industries. The prisons would make the license plates. We had Chesapeake Bay license plates, or they would make the regular license plates for everybody, and they would charge these the state would get them at a bargain. Maybe it would cost the state $5 a license plate to buy it from the state use industries, and everybody else has to pay whatever your registration fee is, for every year, $40, $80, whatever it is. They're making out like that. So in Maryland, the state use industries, the prisons, also made boxes. They made cardboard boxes. So when I worked for one of my school systems, we always bought our shipping boxes through the state allocation plan for the shipping for cardboard boxes. Much cheaper than going and buying shipping, cardboard boxes, from a vendor. So we were billed for that, but we got to do it. It was just another great benefit. So build costs earn revenue for the larger agency. They're treated as direct costs, and the example would be the copier paper that they would charge for, or any of the snow removal, or the grass cutting, or the landscaping, whatever, the copier, the toner, website maintenance. Huge. That would be huge for people. And the state has the burden of keeping these different kinds of costs separate. They have to make sure that they can keep track of which of these costs under their allocation plans are allocated and which are billed. So here is a little graphic to show you, okay, we've got our counties and our city governments, and they are direct connects. They will most likely get allocated costs for everything under the cost allocation plan, but we're going to let our recipients and our subrecipients who receive our grants, we're going to let them, for the procurement contracts, use our standing procurement contract. They're going to have to pay us. They're not going to get it for free, but it's still going to be attractive pricing. And then they don't have to go through that burden of the procurement process with the bids. So there are benefits of these shared services even when they're billed. You're going to have attractive pricing. The contractors are already going to be approved. They're already going to be previously vetted. The state has already done that hard work. There's going to be faster delivery, faster processing, and it is recognized as an efficient procurement process, even under the uniform guidance. And the current provision in the uniform guidance is 200-318E, which says that recipients and subrecipients can use the state's, these shared allocation plans for procurements if it's available to them. Now, this number is going to change when the uniform guidance goes into effect in November from the revision, because they've added some additional provisions, so it shifted the numbers a little bit. So it might be 319, it might be 320, but there are a couple additional provisions in there, so the numbers have shifted a little bit. But if you're looking it up today with the current version of the uniform guidance, it's going to be 200-318E. So what are the risks of these shared services under these caps, these cost allocation plans? Well, you have to be careful. They're audit findings. The larger agency has got to be very careful keeping these two different kinds of services separated. They've got allocated services and they've got billed services, and they've got to document both of them. They've got to keep track of the revenue that they receive because they're charging for the billed services. And then the larger agencies must document the billings. So in summary, and we're moving along pretty well, there are different types of costs. You have direct costs and you have indirect costs, and you need to know the difference between the two. And what might be direct and indirect for your organization might not be the same for somebody else. It's very individualized according to the organization. And then there are different types of indirect cost rates. And there are different types of indirect cost rate formulas. And depending, now institutions of higher ed will typically use the F&A, the facilities and administrative, because they have their big campuses, but they could use another kind of formula if they wanted to. State governments typically use, and very stable non-federal entities will typically use the predetermined rates. But again, these are just very broad classifications, and the type of rate and the type of formula that you would use would really pretty much depend. You'd have to run through with some numbers, and you'd have to run through the different calculations to see which one is better. Cost allocation plans provide shared services either as allocated costs or as billed cost, indirect or direct costs, to related agencies that is shared beyond their own institution or their own agency. So that's it for the presentation. Amy, do we have any questions?
We do. So let me bring those up. And again, if anybody has some questions, please put them in the questions box. We are coming up to the end of our time, so we'll go over a few minutes. But again, we will send out the recording for this presentation to everyone if you do have to leave a little early. So here, one of the first questions, and some of these may have been already answered through the presentation, but can you please help folks understand how rates are applied to IDC bases? I'm not sure what IDC stands for. It says this can be confusing and impacts whether an entity will allow you to apply your negotiated rates.
So the IDC, that's your direct costs.
The direct
And the
cost rate,
direct,
yeah.
the direct costs are half of the formula. So the indirect cost rate is going to be a ratio, how much indirect cost to the direct costs. So the indirect costs are always on the numerator and the direct costs are always on the denominator. That's why they're called a direct cost base. And the different formulas will affect the indirect cost rate. So you can have the same non-federal entity and you have your data, that you have their budget sheet. They've done their little worksheet and they've got all their indirect costs on one side of the line and all the direct costs on the other side of the line. Now, if you apply a different formula, you're going to end up with a different indirect cost rate, depending upon so which one is better? It is confusing. Is an indirect cost rate of 80% that's based only on salaries. So you can't apply it to anything else. You're using a formula that's only based on salaries. Is 80% on salaries only more advantageous than to use 30% that you get because you're using all direct costs, and that changes the base. And you have to understand the different formulas, which we didn't go into in this short webinar. I hope to have given you enough information so now you can formulate a better question with your financial advisors back in your institution. But for your direct costs that you divided out, it depends which indirect cost rate formula you use. Are you going to use total direct costs? Are you going to use modified total direct costs? Are you going to use salaries only? Maybe you're a social worker firm and you rent office space and you mostly have social workers working for you and you don't have, maybe a few computers, but most of your costs are salaries. So maybe it's better to do an indirect cost on salaries only. So it depends on what formula you use. And you're right, it is confusing. And the only way that you can tell is just to plunk in some numbers with these different formulas to see which rate is better. And if you're interested, I can provide a part two to this short webinar where we actually do some calculations. We talk about the different rates, and I can give you a worksheet, a budget and a worksheet, and we can do calculations together so you can see how using a different formula affects the outcome of the rate. So put that in your evaluation if that's of interest to you. Yeah.
Yeah, we definitely have a lot of questions about this. So we had a couple questions. No problem. We have a couple. We have a couple questions about pass-through agencies and subrecipients. So one question is, do pass-through agencies have discretion in allowing provisional rates proposed from subrecipients?
Pass-throughs cannot make any decision. Pass-throughs, there is very limited discretion. Let me put it this way for pass-throughs. If the subrecipient wants to use the de minimis rate, for example, and they're eligible for it now, and they say, we want to use the de minimis rate, you have to accept it from them. You can't tell them, no, you can't use it. What if they have a negotiated rate and they want you to negotiate the rate for them? Well, then you have to negotiate it based on the proposal that they submit to you. You can't just come up with an arbitrary indirect cost rate. That's not allowable under the uniform guidance. So there's nothing that's arbitrary discretion that way, using the word discretion. It either has to be the de minimis rate or, unless there's a program statute says no indirect cost rates for anybody. So it has to be the de minimis rate, or they have to go through a negotiated rate process. But you can't just say, well, 22% sounds good to me. How about that? You can't pull one out of the air and say, okay, and they can't just tell you, well, we want that rate. No, they have to actually do a proposal with the formula.
Okay, and here's another question about maybe an agency within California, if it's never done a grant, who's never had a grant eligible for de minimis. Trying to understand the question. So, basically, does that $35 million apply, towards each like small agency within the state, if they're kind of part of that larger state agency that's getting more than 35 million?
If you're an office within the state, yeah, that applies to you. But if you're like a county government or a city government or a school system, you're a separate jurisdiction, then that 35 million is individual to you. So if you, as your unique separate jurisdiction, receives less than $35 million of federal funding each year, then yeah, you would be eligible for the de minimis. Now, I'm not an auditor, I'm not a CPA, I'm not an attorney, as I'm speaking very boldly to you, so I cannot give you legal or financial advice, but I hope that I can give you insights, and then you can ask that question to your legal advisors and give them the citations that I provided to you in this webinar so that they can check the source language themselves. But my understanding as your instructor is that if you're a separate jurisdiction, that 35 million is only for you, not for the whole state.
Another question about any good examples out there of the policy you're talking about, having an indirect rate policy or a de minimis rate policy. Any good examples?
I do not. I have an example of one for a de minimis rate, and I can make that example available to the governor's office, and they can post it. Let me put a note to myself. I have a de minimis example. I don't have examples about the regular indirect, the broader use of indirect costs, because it depends on each separate entity. I have helped organizations come up with their indirect cost rate proposals. You can go to websites, and there may be some available. There is the National Grants Management Association. There is the Grant Professionals Association, and there is the American Institute of CPAs, AICPA.org. Now, all of these professional associations would love for you to be a member, but they have a lot of free resources on their sites that are open to the general public. You do not have to be a member to access a lot of their information in their libraries. So those would be good websites to check.
Okay, I think we'll just do one final question, and it was, can executive director labor costs be a direct cost on a grant if they're working directly on the project?
Yes.
Yes.
Now you have to be able to define it. And that happens a lot with smaller nonprofits where you have an executive director who's running the nonprofit. So an executive director is usually an indirect cost. The salaries for that executive director is usually an indirect cost. But if that executive director splits his or her time between running the nonprofit and actually delivering services on a grant, that's perfectly fine. And in your indirect cost rate proposal, or if you're using de minimis in your policy statement or in your certification, you would just define, 60% of the time for the executive director is indirect costs, and 40% of time when they're working directly on the grant is direct costs. You just have to be clear, and then make sure your auditor or your CPA or your local financial advisors approve of the wording that you're using. But yes, it is possible for someone to have split salaries, direct, and not just executive directors, but it could be other people too.
Okay, great. So definitely a lot of interest, a lot of kind of some questions about calculations that may be a little too specific to get into now, but definitely this gives people a lot of really great information about what this concept is and how they might try to work on it. So I think with that, we'll just wrap up the final slides here of the presentation. Karen.
Great. So please be reminded, just as I was saying, this is intended to provide general information. It does not constitute legal or financial advice. So please consult with your legal and financial advisors. However, I hope that the information has provided you with some insights as you further pursue your work in the grants community. And for those of you this is prepared for the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And there is my contact information if you'd like to email me with a question. If it's something broad enough that I feel I could answer, I'm happy to answer. Or the questions that Amy has that we did not have time to answer, she will share all those questions with me. And if it's something that I'm in a position to be able to answer, I will go ahead and provide her with written responses to the questions that I can answer, and she can post those on her site and make them available to all of you. So that brings us to an end, Amy.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Karen. And thank you everyone for attending. And again, we will be planning some additional web series of grant trainings in the future. We'd love to get your ideas on what would be most helpful for you on that. So please look out for the follow-up email tomorrow and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.